Welcome to Power Up, the podcast that uncovers the unique challenges women leaders face today. Join your hosts, Nat and Kristen, as we dive into the tough topics and provide actionable insights you can apply right now. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any episodes.
In the last year, we have had a huge amount of change, which has got us really thinking about how we navigate it and how we bring our best selves to work, not necessarily our whole selves to work. And we've written about this in the newsletter this week. AI this year has become a massive thing. It used to be movies only, and now it's a thing. We've had interest rates and inflation shooting up, which has massively transformed how businesses can borrow money, but also our own personal lives if you have a mortgage or savings. We've also been forced to work from home a couple of years ago and are now navigating return to office mandates, and there's plenty more change afoot. So we thought today was a good idea to talk about the role of leadership and authenticity and how much is too much to share when you are navigating these really big challenges.
Yeah, it was so interesting watching over COVID the rise of the empathetic leader, and this is transforming from this autocratic top-down control and command leader that built these incredible businesses we're surrounded by today. However, COVID was this perfect inflection point where a new style of leadership was displayed, one full of caring, of empathy, about making sure our people are okay, and recognizing the correlation between my people being okay equals engagement at work, equals performance at work, equals optimizing all the great things as it relates to my product, my business, my service. And so there was this rise of this empathetic leader, and some of the traits were what, Nat? They were being vulnerable, being open, maybe saying, I don't have all the answers, being sincere.
Yeah, really just being more emotionally aware and available to your team in all sorts of ways. And all of those traits are exceptional. However, there is, like everything, a continuum, and there is a line where your role as a leader is to provide a path for people or certainty or security. We've talked in the past about the definition of leader as having followers. So you need to provide something to follow. And if you are feeling stressed or panicked or uncertain, or you're going through a bit of a crisis at home, where is the line, the point on the line that you should share, and where's oversharing that might actually be kind of unhelpful?
Yeah, and we've titled this, Is There Such a Thing as Being Too Authentic? Yeah, and I think communicating in times of crisis or change, there's a lot of nuance there. And we've got a few stories where we're really trying to navigate that balance of when is over communicating, first of all, legal or acceptable in the eyes of like the board or leadership teams. How much can you communicate and what, versus how much should you communicate before panic ensues in your people?
And there's a couple of points that come out of that, and especially for women on the way up. So not all of us have the job titles or the direct reports, but I think one of the key points there that may not be well understood is as you get more and more senior, you actually get privy to more and more information, of which not all of it you're legally allowed to share. And I would really encourage, if you're in a position where you don't understand decisions made by leaders, again, practice empathy of either getting really curious and asking in a non-passive aggressive way, I don't really understand why you made this decision. Based on the information I've had, I'd really like to know more. Fair, you can do that. Or recognizing that there probably is information that is leading to this that you may not know. And I'm saying that because I think we can have a tendency to assume we can see the whole puzzle and get really, really frustrated. But when you, as we've all probably experienced right from our first job up, after you move from that first job, you realize that you actually get more information, and that continues to happen as you move up, and more accountability and more responsibility for owning the outcome of that information. I think there's something in this for everyone, regardless of job title.
Yeah, so there is this idea of responsibility in terms of keeping some of that information confidential, but then also recognizing that when there's times of uncertainty, people need something. And I can think of an example earlier on in my career where I received feedback in my 360 review that they were like, when Kristen is stressed, we know. And we were dealing with about 6 months of runway, which was money left for the business to run. It was a startup. So you do join startups that are relatively uncertain. But when you get down to your last 6 months of money, that can be very stressful because you might be facing unemployment as an example, and people could see it in my face. And when I was unsettled, I was coming into work as my whole self, which was stressed out and worried because I felt the weight of, 30 people on my shoulders.
Yeah.
And they were like, when Kristen is stressed, we're stressed. And behind all that stress was this real genuine movement in our existing investors that they were going to back the business and we were going to raise money and be fine, which we were. However, it was unhelpful, my feelings, and displaying those feelings. It caused undue stress. And so that almost communicating, even that we only had 6 months left, there was this kind of balance between what is fair for people to plan their lives, those that are supporting families, versus what is causing undue panic and stress. And that was a balance that I had to kind of rein my emotions in and collect my thoughts and communicate very clearly about the next steps and what, I don't know, our future look like.
I have so many questions for that, but my first one is, how did you do that? Like, how did you switch from showing your stress to not showing your stress? Like, what were the tools you used?
Well, first of all, I had to find emotional outlets outside of that workplace. So I probably upped my running at the time and communicating.
Hashtag Fitzbo.
Yes. And communicating with appropriate leaders, be it outside or inside the business, and recognize those were the places to display concerns or anxiety and get all of my questions answered. And I just had to put on a bit more of a professional front actually at work. Yeah, so I think it was self-discipline in terms of how I came to work.
Yeah, I like that. And I think runway is such an interesting topic when it comes to small businesses anyway, or any business, because runway is effectively how much money you have to survive as a business. Before the money's gone, you're out. And most of us actually throughout our careers don't think about that at all. And when you're working in a larger organization, you tend to not even think about runway, but every business has a runway. And I think if you are someone on the way up, this is one of the ways you can start to dabble in boosting up your financial literacy, is really understanding the role of runway, money in the bank, and how that impacts business decisions. Because I've heard many, many times people complaining or not understanding why a business decision is made. And my question back has always been, is there a reason why they need to bring money in the door right now? Because if you're not factoring that in, you'll probably never understand, because you're living in this world where there's an infinite money tree and sometimes you can make strategic decisions, whereas sometimes you actually just got to get the money in the door somehow, and that might lead to a few compromises. So highly recommend people start to think about that when they're considering some of the decisions leadership makes in businesses, because it's often the unthought of third factor in decision making.
Do you have a story, a learning about how much is too much?
Well, I had the opposite. When we decided to leave Hatch, that was for multiple reasons. We weren't allowed to talk about it. And we could have. And there were a couple of people, and I remember feeling pretty awful about this. There were a couple of people at Hatch who felt really betrayed when we announced it, and they had no idea. And so we'd done a fantastic job of lack of transparency. And looking back, my justification, and I still stand by it, my justification at the time is it actually put them at risk, because them knowing the information led to the opportunity for them to potentially share it in ways that would have been unhelpful to them, but also the rest of the team. Because once you know stuff like that, that's a massive change. You then have to have the responsibility of acting in a way that, in the way that secures the information. So I think it was the right decision, but I think it was a real insight into me about the consequences of not being fully transparent, and that's often the case, you can't be, and how that has an impact as well. So I don't know if we could have maneuvered any further down the line and been more open, but I think that was a real insight into me of how transparent we probably usually are, and how much of a betrayal it felt when we weren't.
Well, and it fits. There's a few points of why you might not want to be your whole self as a leader in an organization. One is it can seem unprofessional, and the second is that it can cause a lot of stress and whiplash, which what we've just given two examples where those that could have been or did happen. And then finally, it can also make it hard to make tough decisions. And so where I'm getting with those 3 points is there actually is a difference between being friends with someone and being a leader in an organization. And it is lonelier when people get to the top, because you have to keep some information closer to your chest because you're the one that has to make tough and impartial decisions. And if we were just mates with everyone and friends with everyone, it can make it, all of those things can be true.
Yeah, and I think I followed very similar tactics. I'm not a very, like, I don't think I get super stressed out. Like, I get uncomfortable. I think, and I'm very careful with words around this because I think I think I've always, yeah, I don't know what it is, but I don't tend to feel stressed. But there was one time in one startup where a competitor made a big move and I had an absolute internal meltdown. And I did exactly what you ended up doing. I called my parents, got an Uber to their house and just sat and cried in the lounge for about 3 hours while my parents looked sort of blankly at me because they had no concept of why I would be so stressed. And then once I got it out, I was like, oh yeah, this is not that big a deal. And I could go back to work the next day feeling fine. But I just felt the shakes coming and just was like, there is no point in me being here in front of people where I'm about to lose it. And so it's actually better to exit myself from the situation as quickly as possible. And smart. I think that's a easy tool as well that we sometimes don't utilize, because I know someone at the moment who's going through a situation where someone is showing stress on their face or their feelings on their face very openly, maybe doesn't realize it. And the impact of that on the wider team is you sometimes don't realize how much you're showing, I suppose. So I think I've always got the assumption that I'm probably showing more than I want to. So if I'm feeling that feeling, get away from the situation.
Yeah, so good. And I think especially in this environment of restructures, there are people in leadership roles now who know that's coming, but don't, and possibly know the departments or the people that might be affected, but legally and through a fair and just process, that is just not something that you can communicate or share or gossip about. And then I suppose the other thing which has been interesting for me to watch is sitting at a governance level, you kind of know everything, yet you have to maintain a really good relationship with the executive team and you have respect for them. But that's a perfect example of navigating this nuance of what you can and should share versus what you can't as a leader.
And this is a really interesting challenge because we've spoken in the past a lot about there should be no surprises, like when it comes to performance reviews. And I think we still absolutely stand strong on that. And my ideal is that there's actually very few surprises in general. And I know Rhiannon McKinnon, who was our first interview for our women leaders, she spoke a lot. So the company she was the CEO of was acquired in the last year or so. And she spent a lot of time talking to the team about, we don't know what's coming. We actually don't know what's coming. We know something big is happening. And I know obviously a little bit more than you know, can't share it, and was just very open about, we're going to be in this together. It's going to be a challenging time. And let's one foot in front of the other and we're in it along the way. And I think that was such a great example of where sometimes you can say something's coming, it's not going to be great. Whatever information you can share, you can sort of ease people into that. And I think with redundancies at the moment, there's very much, I see a lot of that happening with leaders sort of saying, yep, there's uncertainty ahead. We have to plan for several eventualities. We don't know which eventuality. And you can take people along and sort of really re-emphasize how much of a team you are and how you're going to work together and you're going to figure it out.
And I think the concept of empathetic leadership takes a really collaborative approach. And Rhiannon was a great example in that she was the ultimate of bringing people around her and diverse perspectives and helping her navigate tough decisions. But it is interesting that in times of change and crisis, sometimes you have to dial back empathetic leadership. You actually don't need a ton of inputs, and sometimes the decision needs to be made quite quickly and impartially. And that is another scenario where dialing back empathetic leadership and just making a decision to move forward in really challenging times is sometimes what's needed.
Well, it's sometimes it's normally the best thing you can do, because staying without making a decision is really almost the worst decision you can make. And I always remember, and I think I've said this before, the best advice Dad's ever given me, he used to run our defence force here, used to make a lot of big decisions with not enough time or information. And he always said the power of hindsight. People will look back and they will judge your decisions because you made them with half or a quarter of the information they now have and no time. And you just have to expect that that's going to be the case. But if you back yourself to have made the right decision at the time with the information and time you had, then you can stand by that decision regardless of the pushback you get, which I have always felt like really helps me when I'm in those times of having to make a call without all of that information, and then just really confidently articulate that to the team, because it is the best decision we could make at the time.
Which brings us to some do's. We've talked about a few things about don'ts and why you might rethink overly empathetic or authentic leadership styles, but there are a few do's, and that leads nicely to my first do, which is do express honesty but optimism. We've talked about that a little bit here, and that is in the newsletter. I think you were like, we used to really value this value of transparency, but transparency can be really scary and can be counteractive with what you need a team to just get on and do their great work and not have burdens weighing them down. Therefore, we switched from transparent to honesty, which is sometimes, I do not know yet, but I know as a team, here's where the optimism comes in. We do great things all the time, and we're going to navigate through this. And ultimately, there's always, what is it, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, or light beyond the,
light at the end of the tunnel.
Light at the end of the tunnel. I'm terrible with sayings. There's always a way out of this.
Yeah, and I think there was a really great example. We spoke to a person who ran an agency at the beginning of lockdown, and their income stream just plummeted off a cliff. So they had a thriving business beforehand, and their people had no concept. They'd never really shared the finances of the business. And so they were suddenly stuck in this position of, we don't know what's coming. We know our business has fundamentally changed, and we need to have some honesty with our team, but not freak them out. So they brought everyone together, and they just created a pretty simple chart of green and red for each month, and said, here is the history of our business, and it's been green every month. This month is red, and that looks pretty scary because we've brought in less money than we need to survive. But all those green months before are the things that have given us the money in a savings account to be able to cover for a couple of these. But we can't cover for too many of these. So we need to work together now. So without doing the full financial accounts and the full background and really sort of digging into their stress and probable panic about how they were going to survive, they were honest with their team, and they gave them enough information that they could all see the target and all know that they were working together to achieve it. But also that leadership had a plan, that they had money set aside, they'd planned for the situation, and they wanted them on board now. And I just thought that was such a great example of the difference. They didn't need to share everything. They shared enough to be honest and to get people along on the journey.
And I think that is a perfect way to actually do restructures as well as leaders, in that you are honest that there are going to be changes coming. People will be impacted, but you can be optimistic in that we have established a great process. We have great exit packages. Those who are affected will be supported. It might come with coaching or retraining or whatever it might be. I think there's also really great guidebooks and playbooks out there of how to do restructures well with honesty but optimism.
Yeah. And my second do, my first do, your second do, our combined second do, is I'd like to say start early. And this is one of the big barriers we've heard recently to people becoming Powrsuit members, is they self-select out of being a leader. They don't look at themselves and think of themselves as a leader. And the example I often give these days is, it's so weird that you don't get any leadership training until you're put into a leadership position, and then suddenly you're expected to know everything. Whereas our philosophy at Powrsuit is that leadership exists at every level, and that the sooner you start to put in place these skills, the more easy it will be to be identified as a leader and get those promotions and then succeed when you're in those positions. So I think when we're talking about this topic, it's very easy to look at this and go, I'm not in one of those positions. I don't have that job title. In my experience, and we've been through a lot of this, and I think at Hatch Together, we saw many situations where we had big, hard challenges. We brought the first global IPO to New Zealand. And in that position, that was our first time probably that we handed off almost full responsibility to our team. And I know it was incredibly hard. I also know they did an incredible job. And one of the things that really set apart people in that situation was the people who didn't understand why we did it and were letting them step up, felt really overwhelmed by the challenge, and then the people who saw it as a massive opportunity and they got stuck in and they came to us with challenges, and they almost embodied these same principles of honesty over transparency. I'm sure they were talking to their friends about how panicked they were about how they were going to deliver this thing, but they came to us with really great reports and really great questions, and I had absolutely no doubt in their ability to step up after that. And I think if we're talking about do's and don'ts with honesty versus transparency, practice it early. It is not your job, to be clear. It is, you are not getting the paycheck to justify this. So if you are feeling really wobbly, it is actually your manager's job to support you through that and be open about that. But if you are in a position where you think you have the ability to take on a bit of this and practice some of these skills, highly, highly recommend, because you will show yourself as a leader.
Yeah, I love that. Skill development early. My next do is do communicate often. Sometimes as leaders, we feel that we can't communicate if there's nothing to say, but opening up communication channels is really just saying we want to hear from you and we want to provide that emotional connection to hear what's on your mind. And you can ask questions. We may not have the answers, but we are going to make ourselves available to you. So I remember being part of a merger, which was very scary for people who knew they would be ultimately impacted. And so I set up a bi-weekly call where I said, we won't have the answers, but this is your chance every 2 weeks to show up and just ask what's on your mind, share what's on your mind, connect as a group. Even though I didn't have anything to share all the time, that was really important to communicate often. And it wasn't about what we had to communicate. It was about them feeling heard.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the addition to that is something that happened to me once that I really like, is that active listening part. Is you don't have to have all the answers. It is about listening. And I remember someone once, when I was feeling pretty annoyed about something, she actually pulled me aside and very calmly and very caring said, I want to hear why you're so frustrated with this, and really empathize with it, because I was right to feel frustrated. The decision was not a great one. And just by actually being able to say my piece really built trust between us, but also made me feel like what I felt was valid, and because it was, rather than sort of being undermined. So I think sometimes when we are dealing with hard situations, it's very easy to shy away from confronting them. Like, it's very easy to avoid them and think somehow it will go away. And I've heard this with people who are going through serious illness as well, as they think when people don't speak to them about it, that they're like, I'm not forgetting that I'm going through this by you not talking to me about it. So really just listening and asking questions and checking in is, I mean, I feel like I'm adding to your point, but to me it feels like that one-on-one thing as well, and embedding in your people leaders that ability to keep checking in and ask questions and see how things are going for people.
Our final, but such a biggie is to remember that you are a leader, not always a friend. So find your people outside of work to be frank with. That can be your peer group, your personal board of directors. It can be a friend, a partner. These are the people that you can go to and share everything you need to share within legal bounds, and kind of vent and get some great feedback, get your messaging right, get your comms right, so that then you can go back and really display leadership qualities and assurance and clarity and communication to your team and your people at work.
Fabulous. And the only addition to that is that group might change over time.
Yes.
And I've noticed that recently, and we both have peer groups, and I was thinking about what the things were about my peer group that brought us together. And one was we were all going through times of change. We were either had just taken a big step up, we were starting a company, other people were thinking about new work. But the second part is we were at a similar level, and we do that at Powrsuit too. We group people based on career stage, because you do find if you actually need people who have gone through similar to be able to actually understand. And sometimes I find the worst thing is when you are talking to people who haven't been through it, they can be really critical of, or have no concept of how tough it is, because, the further you rise, the more people don't necessarily empathize with your situation. So surround yourself with people who've been there or who are going through it, because those people might look different over time, but they will be infinitely helpful, and you will get so much inspiration and from their lived experience on how to manage those situations.
Fabulous. I hope you all found that helpful.
Yeah, we'd like your tips too, right? It's always nice to hear, are you going through a tough time? What are you doing? What's really worked? How did you bring your team along, or the people around you, or influence from below if you are further down a hierarchy than someone else, and really practice this idea of bringing your best self to work, not necessarily your whole self to work.
Exactly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Check out Powrsuit.com and our membership network. We'd love to meet you in person on the other side. And we'll catch you next time. Bye.